When I was serving in my first settlement as a new minister in a rural area of New England, I had occasion to visit a regular guest of the congregation who was incarcerated in the local correctional facility. I didn't want to go. I had never been inside a jail, and I knew I would get claustrophobic. Everything about this opportunity for ministry was scary to me in its unknown. The congregant was young, newly coming out as transgender, estranged from their family, with no one except their partner to visit them. I had to find the courage to go. I didn't have a clergy collar back then to proclaim my role, but I had my UU values rooted in our Jewish and Christian heritage. I had quoted that scripture from the pulpit where Jesus says, "For I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. I was naked and you gave me clothing. I was sick and you took care of me. I was in prison and you visited me." The pastoral imperative couldn't have been clearer. Love was calling. So I went. As each door clanged heavily and locked behind me, I felt my anxiety rise. But when the visit began, in a large, fluorescently lighted room, supervised from a high window, I found that the walls were not pressing in. What I experienced instead was an opening into the sacred circle of confidentiality and care, which held both of us in hope. Well, that was then, and this is now, but the way that love calls us into spaces and places and relationships that are unknown continues. I wonder, where is love calling you? In our Unitarian Universalist covenant, it says we draw from our heritages of freedom, reason, hope, and courage, building on the foundation of love. What have we inherited from our past? How do we weave the gifts of the past into the present, building on the foundation of love? Our rich UU heritage evolved over the decades and centuries by building on the foundation each generation inherited. Not without struggle and conflict, not without argument and sacrifice, but also not without joy. You may or may not be aware that the Unitarians and the Universalists were separate religious movements for most of our history, albeit with much in common. The Universalist core values were hope and courage. The Unitarians' core values were freedom and reason. When we search for the UU building blocks, far back into the debates over early Christian doctrine, we find the theologian Arius of Alexandria, Egypt, who argued in the 4th century for the freedom to believe that Jesus was human and maybe partly divine, but not fully divine, not the same as God. We also find the theologian Origen of Alexandria, who argued for universal salvation in the 3rd century. As you may know, Origen and Arius lost those debates. Their beliefs were decreed heresies, and their people heretics. But the word heretic simply means one who chooses. Freedom to choose is the bedrock of our UU foundation. First Church's Minister Emeritus, Drew Kennedy, used to teach our new members about UU history using the metaphor of drawing the circle wider after each major controversy resolved. So, I'm taking from his notes a little bit here. The Unitarian controversy raged from 1815 to 1819 in New England, resulting in the emergence of Unitarianism as a separate denomination from the Congregationalists. The Orthodox Congregationists and the liberal Congregationalists argued about contrasting beliefs: a stern, judgmental God versus a loving God, human nature as depraved versus human nature as good, and whether the Bible proclaimed the Trinity or the unity of God. As is often the case during controversy, a spokesperson emerges. William Ellery Channing was the spokesperson for Unitarianism when he preached a very long sermon called Unitarian Christianity in 1819 at a new colleague's ordination ceremony. Channing's sermon spelled out the theological foundation of Unitarianism and drew the circle wide for liberal Congregationalists to claim themselves Unitarian. Fairly soon, building on this freedom of thought, these new Unitarians were challenged from within. During the Transcendentalist controversy, they were challenged by Transcendentalist leaders Margaret Fuller, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, and Theodore Parker. The Transcendentalist controversy of the 1830s and 40s debated whether Christianity was truly a superior religion. The Transcendentalists emphasized direct experience of the divine through human intuition and encounters in nature. There were heated arguments and pamphlet wars, which, for those of you who have never seen a pamphlet, it's like a blog or a long Instapost on paper. Theodore Parker delivered a very long sermon in 1841 called The Transient and Permanent in Christianity. The gall of it, that anything could be called transient, impermanent in Christianity. Well, he suffered for that. Afterwards, Parker's Unitarian colleagues refused to exchange pulpits with him, which was a deeply felt censure of his views. Would the Transcendentalists be tolerated? Eventually, yes, the Unitarians drew the circle wider in allegiance to the foundation of the free mind. An interesting detail, Parker's sermon was in 1841 out east. Our congregation was founded in 1842 here in Milwaukee. Well, then came the issue in the West, which really was the Midwest as we know it, in the 1870s to 1895. It was Team Unitarian Christian versus Team Unitarian Theist. Woo! I know, but it was a heated argument. The Unitarian Christians could not imagine their religion without centering Jesus, while the Unitarian Theists argued that liberal religion could include those who believed in God, but did not center Jesus. Again, pamphlet and pulpit wars until our movement drew the circle wide to include both sides, building on the foundation of the free mind. Then, of course, came another debate, because that is what we like to do. We have ideas. We argue the humanist theist debate of 1913 to 1933, led by John Dietrich of Minneapolis. The debate between God versus no God was no less heated, as you can imagine. Could someone be a Unitarian if they did not believe in God. Several pamphlet and pulpit wars later, the answer was yes. Building on the foundation of the free mind, our forebears drew the circle wider still. Well, how did the Unitarians and the Universalists eventually get together? The youth led the way. When the youth groups in each movement got together in the 1950s, united in their similarities, they challenged the adults to consider merging denominations. But, as we know, adults are slower to change. And there were power dynamics in play. Painting in broad historical strokes, Universalists in the United States were primarily farmers and laborers, working class people. Unitarians were from the elite, landowners, business owners, lawyers, doctors, professors. With the emphasis on individual freedom and reason from the Unitarians, along with their class power and privilege, trample on the core values of universal love, hope, and courage of the Universalists. It took many conversations, but eventually, in 1960, when I was born, the Unitarians and Universalists came together, well, first separately in Boston, the Holy Land, and each group voted overwhelmingly for consolidation. The delegates present on that historic occasion said the emotional climax came as the two groups joined together after the votes for worship, as they collectively streamed into the sanctuary as a new uniting body. They sang the hymn, "As tranquil streams that meet and merge," over and over until everyone was joined together in the same room. And that consolidation was formalized in 1961. Well, the 1960s was a tumultuous time, as we know. UUs were supportive of civil rights, but had trouble living out the core value of love on the institutional level. The Black empowerment controversy of 1967 to 1970 engaged the conflict between integrationist UUs and Black caucus approaches to racial justice work. Set in the cauldron of urban uprisings filled with people frustrated that civil rights legislation had not alleviated African American poverty, and the grief and rage after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Black empowerment and Unitarian Universalism clashed with the slow pace of our majority white institutionalists, who were more concerned about proper democratic process at the UUA. Funding was promised from the UUA to the Black Affairs Council of UUs, but then it was reduced significantly when the UUA was facing a budget deficit. It was a slap in the face, deeply discouraging, and felt as a betrayal by many. The 1970s brought controversy over gender-inclusive language and women's rights in our movement, culminating in the 1977 Women and Religion Resolution, led by lay leader Lucille Shook Longview. This widely involved process opened the door for many women to become ordained UU ministers, breaking the stained glass ceiling. The Women and Religion Resolution also called for an extensive rewrite of our UU principles, our consolidating principles, this was just 20 years after the UUA formed, so that there would be gender-inclusive language, so that the circle would be drawn wider for justice. And that resulted in the principles that we have been proclaiming since the 1980s, our 7 principles. 40 years later, here we are, and UUs are currently debating, because that is what we like to do, another update to our principles and purposes called Article 2 of our UUA bylaws. Article 2 is still in flux, but as of June 2023 General Assembly, the draft states, the purpose of the UUA is to actively engage its members in the transformation of the world through liberating love. Love is the power that holds us together and is at the center of our shared values. Friends, we know that drawing the circle wide with love at the center is the work of many generations, fraught with conflict and controversy, and we know that it does not always end well. Universalist Abner Neeland, for example, was a pantheist, believed that the divine was in every person and every place and all of nature, was tried on charges of blasphemy by his own people, by the Boston religious establishment in the 1830s, when his beliefs were interpreted as gas atheism. He was convicted, his 3 appeals denied, and served 60 days in jail in 1838. Then there was the Reverend William Jackson, an African American who converted to Unitarianism in 1860, was not welcomed at the fall convention of the American Unitarian Association. UU Minister Mark Morrison Reed wrote in his book, Darkening the Doorways, Black Trailblazers and Missed Opportunities in UUism. He wrote, on Thursday, October 11, 1860, a key incident of Unitarian history occurred in New Bedford, Massachusetts. The AUA was holding its annual autumnal convention there, discussing, among other topics, how the AUA might spread the good news about Unitarianism to more people. On the last morning of the 3-day convention, African American minister William Jackson stood and addressed the convention. There he stood, a distinguished-looking man of 42 years of age, an experienced minister, an African American man addressing a sea of white faces. He was about to tell these white Unitarians that he was one of them. He had converted to Unitarianism. The New Bedford Evening Standard News reported, Reverend Mr. Jackson, pastor of Salem Baptist Church of this city, addressed the convention, saying that he subscribed entirely to the doctrines advanced in the discourses which had been delivered before the body. He avowed himself as a convert to the doctrines of liberal Christianity and should endeavor in the future to advocate those sentiments from his pulpit. The Reverend Mr. William J. Potter of this city bore testimony to the character and integrity of Mr. Jackson. He suggested that a collection be taken up in aid of Mr. Jackson's church, which was somewhat in debt. Morrison Reed continues, there was no discussion, there was no welcome, there was no expression of praise and satisfaction that the Unitarian gospel had reached the colored, as that term was used back then. The Unitarians took up a collection and Mr. Jackson was sent on his way. And shocking though it may be to us now, not all Unitarians or Universalists were in favor of abolition in the 1860s. Including some members of our congregation. When First Unitarian Society Milwaukee's minister, our minister, the Reverend Nahor Augustus Staple, preached his fiery anti-slavery sermon on Thanksgiving Day in 1859, some of our members resigned afterwards. Many Black UUs left our movement in the wake of the Black empowerment controversy, a century and a decade later. feeling betrayed by unfulfilled promises. We know today that our individual beliefs are woven tightly into our identities, and it can be challenging to keep drawing the circle wide with love at the center in the service of community. And yet that is what love is calling us to do. I imagine you may want to know what happened to the incarcerated church guests that I visited in New England many years ago. After they served their time and returned to community, they became a member of the congregation I served. It was hard for the rest of the church to embrace them and their partner, to relate authentically across difference. People were uncomfortable, worried about their presence upsetting other members and future guests. They were worried about the optics, as Eric said in his Worship Associate story. This dynamic reminded me of the cliquishness of high school. I know this is challenging, I said to the lay leaders. I know you're uncomfortable, I get it. But we are called to something larger than ourselves. I said to the congregation, we are called to choose love, pointing at the welcoming congregation poster on the wall in the foyer again and again and again. I get it, but we are called to something larger than ourselves. Opening our arms to this couple was not easy. They had a lot of needs, only some of which could be met. But at my goodbye party, after serving that congregation for 10 years, this returning citizen stood to thank me, tears running down their face, and said, Dina, you visited me in prison when no one else came. There are times when we are called to widen the circle of love, to draw that circle wider in our personal lives, our professional lives, in our congregational life, in our movement as Unitarian Universalists. And we are not alone in this. Our rich UU heritage has evolved over the decades and the centuries by building on love, building on the foundation that we inherited, calling us to transform and heal the mistakes of our forebears, calling us into the unknown. We continue to build upon love, not without struggle and conflict, not without debate, because that is what we do, not without argument and even sacrifice, but also not without joy. May it be so.